I always like to start out this session just in general. I guess you guys have been here for a full day doing wellness, and it's hard to do that. It's hard to take time for ourselves. But I always say the corny line, like when you're flying, and they say, "Place the mask on yourself before assisting others," and that's exactly what we have to do to stay well. And we do better by those we work with every day, and we keep our community safer when we focus a little bit on ourselves. So for a lot of us, it can feel really uncomfortable to do that. So I applaud you all for coming. Because of how much time we have, I'm not going to dig into my background much, but in general, the reason I got into the wellness space, I've been in the human trafficking space for about 10 years. And within that time, I worked in various law enforcement agencies as well, and worked with a lot of you and people with medical backgrounds, social work, obviously law enforcement and such, and finding that we're struggling a lot. And I was seeing how that was impacting us in the work. Like people wouldn't show up for meetings, or they would treat victims poorly. They were drinking a lot more. They were having issues at home. And then the workplaces just get really like somber and negative, and everybody's just burnt out and cranky all the time. And that's really where I transitioned this focus about a decade ago onto the wellness piece too, and just seeing what a need there was. So that's really where all of this came from. And also just to keep in mind, I have so many resources and things we're not going to cover today. So again, please reach out for additional resources and questions if we don't get to them today. Also, I know this is a heavy topic, and oftentimes I find that people ask me questions after the fact and would rather stay anonymous. So if you do have comments or questions and you're not comfortable putting them in the chat, there's a bubble on every, I don't know, 10 slides or so with my phone number in it. So please feel free to text me if that is more comfortable, and I'll keep an eye on my phone too as we get through the material. Okay, so to start, I always use this quote, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. I think this is extremely important for all of us with our professions and backgrounds, because we have this idea of like we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And if we can't handle the work, that means we're not cut out for it. And I'm really just trying to change the culture and the narrative around that. In general, we're humans before we are the professions that we choose, right? And we're going to be impacted by the worst in the world. Like we see the absolute worst in the world, and we can't expect to just go about our day, right, and not think about it or be impacted by it. It's just unrealistic. We get vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, and some of the things we'll talk about today because we care, right? We care about the world. We care about the safety of our community. We care about the clients we work with. So we are absolutely going to be impacted by it, and actually should be expected to, which is why these topics are so important, that we really prepare ourselves for the work and find strategies that work for us so we can continue to do the great work that we do. So this quote comes from a book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. And well, I shouldn't say quote, Newton's law, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so he compares that in his book to vicarious trauma. So the way I really break that down is just thinking about your job, and we're constantly at high stress levels, right? We're in like survival mode at work every day, and then we go home assuming we return to normal. But what is happening over time is we start to get depressed or anxious, or slowly develop an addiction, right? Things like that, slowly develop mental health things, and a lot of negative coping skills in general, just to cope and adapt with the work that we do. And so the Newton's law piece, just focusing on when our actions or our daily experiences at work expose us to trauma, which they do, right, constantly, we have to assume there's going to be a reaction or a result that's going to impact us. So again, we can't expect to not be impacted by this. We are going to be impacted by this, and we'll dig into that more. But just to think about it in this Newton's law way, right? Like when we have daily experiences at work that expose us to trauma, we're going to see a result or some type of impact from that. Okay, so if we had more time, I'd really dig in. And for those of you who are comfortable, you are welcome to type into the chat if you would like. Just in general, how the work has impacted you, right? How it changes you. And this can be positive and negative. I like to start positive. Like I've got a 2.5-year-old at home, and I feel like I'm a better parent in that I know how to keep her safe. I know the conversations I want to be having. I know a lot about social media and the dangers of that. I just feel like I'm more vigilant about the world, and I like that, right? My job gives me comfort in how I parent. On the flip side, working in human trafficking for the last 10 years, I was at the park with my daughter a couple weeks ago, and I saw an adult male with a bunch of little children at the park. So what would you all assume my thoughts are, right? Working in human trafficking, seeing 99% of offenders as males, seeing horrific child abuse, right, over my 15-year career in social work. So certainly I'm like watching this man like a hawk. Like, of course, my daughter's over here and I'm watching her too, but I am like zoned in and I'm like, this man has to be a pervert. Like, that's the only rational thought here, that this man like is touching these children, right? And so that is what we'll get into is what secondary trauma or vicarious trauma does to us. And it takes moments that like normal people that don't have these jobs, that they don't see the world we do, right? And it's not always fun to be seeing the world like that all the time, and we don't realize over time how much that impacts us, to see everything as unsafe or dangerous or sketchy. And so for me, it's just changed my views on the world in that way of like, you cannot trust men, right? That is in general an irrational thought. But when we break it down to the work, that when you see something over and over again, it starts to change your worldview shift on things. And for me, that's one of them I have to pay attention to. What happens to the stories you hear at work is something also to start being mindful of. For me, I used to do what I call like word vomit. I would process out loud every horrific detail about every horrific case I had. So now not only am I traumatized, but I'm traumatizing my colleagues, I'm traumatizing my family members and people who are not asking for all of these details. A lot of you in the professions you're in, you repress it, you stuff it away and think it will never come out again. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but we try to just keep it all quiet. What's really difficult is for me in the social work profession, everything that we come across is confidential. Like, we can't really go disclose. And so there's a balance between how do we process what's happened in a healthy way, but we can't disclose a lot about, confidentiality. And of course, you guys have the integrity of your investigations too, where that might apply as well. So balancing that and just understanding, what do I do when I hear or see horrific things? And then were you trained for this? So on one hand, when we're talking now about vicarious trauma, even me in social worky school, you would think we would talk all about feelings and emotions and things, but I didn't learn anything about secondary trauma. Even though so much of my job is focused on mental health and supporting people, I didn't even know what it was, or that I could experience this. There was no warning of that. So looking at, do you have training at your organization or resources to combat this, or to help us stay more resilient? But on the flip side as well, are you trained just to do your day-to-day tasks every day? For a lot of us, when we jump into these careers, there's not great onboarding because we're like in crisis mode with these jobs all the time. And so we don't always have just day-to-day training on like approaches to interviewing, or how do I even input data into the systems in our organization. Like, if we don't have just the basics, we're going to burn out so much quicker, because now we also have a traumatic job on top of not feeling adequate enough to do the job, which adds more stress when we don't understand how to do the job or don't feel equipped. So just thinking about these things as we move through today. And I always encourage people to bring these conversations back to the workplace and to your house, to your household. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. Okay, so terms to understand. We'll buzz through these in the next slide, but just understand that you can have all of these, you can have one of these things can come and go. It's not like once you experience this, like you're stuck with it and labeled with it forever. These are things that we probably all have experienced in our jobs and can expect to continue to, but they're all very different things. We tend to umbrella all of them under burnout. I feel like that's kind of the trendy term we always use, but it's a small piece of what we might struggle with or experience in these jobs. So burnout in general can happen in any job. So when you think about the work you do, this is kind of going back to the vicarious trauma piece too, of if you had a job outside of this career, right? You're a car mechanic, you're a financial analyst, you're something other than what you are, that isn't exposed to trauma every day, you would probably see and view the world very differently, right? I would imagine for all of us, we would not see the world we do now if we had a profession completely outside of this. Regardless of your profession, though, you can have burnout. It can happen in any job. It could just be like, I don't like this job. I'm not passionate about it. I'm sick of it. I don't feel purpose at this job. I'm frustrated. My supervisor's not great, right? Whatever it is, burnout can happen in any type of job, any type of profession. Okay. And you can, one of the ways to alleviate that is just to leave that job, right? With compassion fatigue, I call it the eye roll effect. Like for me, it's when I'm so exhausted of giving. It's literally, the term is what it sounds like. You're fatigued of giving compassion all day long to people, right? Another word for that is empathic strain. So you're just strained of giving empathy. And when I really started to understand this, I was a supervisor at a rape and abuse crisis center in a community I lived that was not super large, but our phones rang 24/7. We had people walking into our doors 24/7. And we have these advocates that just all day long see people who have been raped or abused all day, every day, right? Just one an hour, two an hour. Then we're taking phone calls doing the same thing. And you start to, for one, it's an extreme self-sacrifice, right? But you start to predetermine things. Like when we have a lot of the same type of cases or situations, we forget that each person is still an individual, right? Because we're so fatigued of giving compassion or empathy all day long that we're just burnt out in it, and we actually start to have a decrease in empathy or a decrease in like care for the work, and we forget, really why we signed up for it. So for me, what I do a lot with this when I'm struggling with it is I get pretty impatient, and the last thing I would want is for a client that I'm working with to feel that, right? And we do that a lot and we don't even realize it. And it's like I just give an eye roll when they call me. Like I'm just so fatigued of giving. Then when you go over to the secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, that's the worldview shift, right? That's me saying, I don't trust men anymore. These are the intrusive thoughts that you might have. So one, for example, for me, having a daughter now, I never used to have intrusive thoughts about like child sexual abuse cases that I've seen images of and stuff. But when I change her diaper now, I'll have invasive, intrusive thoughts. Okay. That can also be like maybe fall into the PTSD category. But in general, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, now I'm having intrusive thoughts. My worldview shift has changed. It's that from that difficult repeated exposure that we have. And it's also similar to victims of trauma that we work with. So when I would ask any of you, okay, you've worked with a client or you had a case where someone had a significant trauma, what types of behaviors did you see in that traumatized person? And even if your trauma is indirect, where you don't see the direct trauma, you can have this. You can have this just by hearing about it. I worked with someone who was in a law office and all they did was read cases. They never saw anything. And they had a lot of trauma from just reading cases because that's still difficult, repeated exposure in its own way. So they too were having similar symptoms of trauma like any of our clients or cases would. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's really just when you have some combination of these things, and now it's just impacting your daily functioning, right? Those flashbacks of cases, maybe you're avoiding certain person, place, or thing. It's recurrent stress and anxiety, so you're just so impacted daily, just your functioning, that you might have some post-traumatic stress. And then lastly, something else we struggle with is moral suffering. So the term moral injury came out of the military, and the term moral distress came out of the healthcare profession. And so if I had more time, I would dig into this with a bunch more slides. But in general, thinking about how does your own moral compass or values conflict with the job? So someone that I've worked with who was in the HSI office, many years ago in the 90s, his supervisor told him to arrest a 14-year-old for prostitution. He knew it was wrong. He knew that that person was a victim of human trafficking, but you have a supervisor telling you to do that. And he said, I've just never been able to forget about that, like putting handcuffs on this victim. And that was something, again, you think of moral distress there, right? So you morally know that this is wrong, but your job is telling you have to do it. So there's just some tension between the two, and that can cause some burnout, right? Or that can cause some other issues in the work when we don't take care of that or aren't paying attention to it. Okay, now that we've done the crash course, so something to consider when we're not taking care of ourselves that can happen. Let's say we have some PTSD. So with PTSD, you might have a startle reflex, hypervigilance, right? Memory loss, which a lot of the clients we work with too that are victims of trauma have, fear, flashbacks, right? Different symptoms of PTSD. Moral suffering is more of that emotional response. You have sorrow, grief, regret, those types of things. I've experienced this a lot on different cases I've worked when I've had to do different things that I didn't agree with morally, but again, the job or my code of ethics through social work told me I had to. And when we're not taking care of these things and we see them overlap a little bit, That's when we start to see the anger, depression, anxiety, nightmares, insomnia. That's where we start to self medicate, right? So just thinking about holding ourselves accountable here to just say, what might I be struggling with? And again, these things can come and go. But if I'm not taking care of these things over time, again, that Newton's law, right? The reaction might be in the middle here, things that we might start experiencing. So some things I have heard over the years from people I've worked with is these are just different quotes. So I miss feeling my emotions. That came from a jail administrator I was working with. Our heads kill more of us than IEDs and gunfire. I am mean to my kids. I'm married to my job. I have a hard time relaxing. Gory scenes and movies do not faze me anymore. Nobody's redeemable. I like this one because it's a perfect example of like compassion fatigue, right? You're just so exhausted of giving that you get to a point where you're like, no one's redeemable. And in my world, that's like everyone's going to go back to their trafficker, everyone's going to go back to their addiction. Like we can't save anybody, right? So you just get so fatigued of giving all the time that you get to this point of like giving up. I had empathy when I first started this job, and heavy drinkers drive the cop car, alcoholics sit in the back. We'll talk a little bit more about alcohol in a little bit. And then these are like the cultural shifts I see that we need to work on. So in general, we have this idea again, that mentality, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We don't talk about it. It is what it is, right? And oftentimes what I see in law enforcement agencies is this lipstick on a pig, right? We've all heard that, where it's like we do what we have to do just to say we're doing it, but we're not really doing it. And I see that a lot with for example, I had an agent come to me once and said, we agency wide had to put a wellness app on our phones. We were encouraged to put it on there, and this is how they wanted us to use it. Well, within the wellness app, it says that for those of us in ICAC, we should not have co-location uh, offices, because if I need a break from CSAM material, I don't want to watch it. But if I'm in the same office as my counterpart, then I have to, right? So this app that you told us to download on our phone says we shouldn't do this. And then leadership said, well, too bad, we are going to start combining all of your offices together. So just thinking about these things, like you know, if we're you're on the leadership side thinking we're going to make these changes, but are we checking a box, right? Or are we actually changing the dynamics of the office, right, in the culture to more of a positive, supportive one? And how do we do that? Looking here at different indicators, right? If you're, or excuse me, risk factors, if this is something you're maybe starting to see in yourself or have experienced. So in general, what are your personal circumstances? So again, for me, becoming a parent made me more vulnerable to experiencing vicarious trauma, right? With my intrusive thoughts when I'm changing my daughter's diaper. That has been really difficult for me at times, right? I also, when I started in the human trafficking work, I went through a divorce, and that's where I actually started realizing what a distrust I had in men, because when I tried to like date again, I'm like, what's your social media? What's your criminal background? How do I know you're not addicted to CSAM? Like, I mean, I like could not trust any men, and it was bleeding into my work life, right? My personal work, that was just a vulnerability that I was going through. Other personal circumstances could be maybe you've had a death in your family recently, right? There's just different things that come up for us personally that make it harder for us to have some resiliency to this when work gets hard. Work-related grief and loss, unfortunately, we see that a lot, whether a client or someone we're working with dies, whether we see someone who's died of suicide in our line of work, unfortunately, is not uncommon, as we know. So thinking about those different losses we have, and it could be like your favorite supervisor leaves or your trusted colleague leaves. That can be a grief and loss too, because they were kind of your trusted person in the workplace. Direct exposure to trauma, of course, is a risk factor, as is indirect exposure. Like I said, the person who's in office reading all of the reports, right? That's indirect. Or me hearing a client telling them about their abuse, that's indirect. System challenges, this is a big one. I struggle with this on my side of things, because I might know the perfect program that a client would exceed in, but they have a wait list, right? Or they don't take the right insurance, or don't take their insurance. It also might be maybe we report something to Child Protective Services, but they don't have enough information to intervene in any way. We just have those system challenges and failures that can really burn us out when we see that time and time again in our cases. And it just, we get defeated, right, in the work that we do. Working conditions, of course. Do you work in a positive, supportive workplace, or like a toxic, negative, non-supportive, doesn't believe in the wellness stuff, right? That's obviously going to impact and be a risk factor in how we come back from this or not. And then thinking about the sociocultural context of the world in general, right? Where you live in your community, do they support law enforcement or not? COVID, right? That's a huge thing that changed the political climate. All of those things impact us personally, so it's going to at some point impact our work as well. So just again, seeing how the two can go back and forth and really causes more exhaustion or more burnout. So thinking about yourself in these categories and how that might impact you over time. 6 causes of burnout. I really like this article. If you look it up, it's by Elizabeth Saunders. It's really short and sweet, but it just made a lot of sense to me, especially in our line of work. Obviously, workload for us is very unpredictable. And I used to work in treatment foster care, and I think our average caseload size was supposed to be like 6 kids, and most of the time I had like 18, right? So of course, workload for all of us, we have an incredible amount of work at all times. Perceived lack of control, which again in our jobs it feels like we have very little control over the cases and the work that we do sometimes. No reward, no connection to community, unfairness in the workplace, and a values mismatch. Okay, so just again too, if you're in leadership, thinking about these things, bringing them back to where you work to talk through, right? How can we look at each one of these categories specifically and work on them, right? Think about how can we make these things align more with those that work for us. Okay, and again, you don't have to be in a leadership supervision position to bring these things back to the organization to talk about, and especially if some of these resonate with you. Okay, so speaking of the 6 causes of burnout, something to pay attention to that might happen as you go along as well is, paying attention to yourself. Again, I'm going to use the word mindful a lot, just being very mindful of what's going on between brain and body as we go. We'll talk more about that. But are you more of an absenteeism person? So you miss work a lot, you're just not available, you're mentally not there, you're quiet quitting, right? You start to show up late, you just don't really do what you're supposed to do. Or are you too present, right? You work all the time, you don't take breaks. Everybody knows you as the person that works hard and doesn't take breaks, and they can call on vacation, right? I'm very guilty of that. You don't use your vacation and sick time, and you're always available even when you shouldn't be. So just thinking about when you are overworked, burnt out, maybe dealing with some vicarious trauma, do you see one of these in yourself, and how do these things impact everybody in the office? We'll talk more about presenteeism too as we go, because I think that applies more here to us. So talking about stuffing it all away, like I brought up in the beginning, how do you process, right? What does that look like? And a lot of us say like, oh, I'm going to compartmentalize that. But to compartmentalize is actually a healthy thing. That is when you kind of, you take the emotions or maybe something horrific that you're seeing, and you kind of put it in a little tiny box in your brain, and you'll come back to it. Excuse me. So it's the way that we can do our jobs, really. Like the way you guys are able to show up every day is because you can compartmentalize things, right? So you can continue doing what needs to be done. What a lot of us do though is we just stuff it away in Pandora's box, okay? And we repress and we say, oh, we're good, we're fine. I had another friend that works for HSI, and he got transferred to the CSAM unit doing all the child pornography cases, and he has 2 littles at home. And so I called him once and I said, how are you? How's the work going? He's like, oh, it could be worse. I'm like, you have the worst job in the world. Like, you truly have the worst job in the world, and you have 2 littles at home. Like, don't feed me that BS. Like, how are you really doing? Right. But I think part of that is compartmentalizing, because he's trying to not go there in his mind and keep a healthy, kind of like denial. On the flip side, of course, I talked to him about like, are you sure you're not just stuffing it away? Like, you got to be a little more honest with yourself about the work that you're doing here, right? Because if we stuff it away, we just become numb, we become disconnected, we become irritable. Substance use, that's where that starts to sneak in, because we're not talking about it. So just thinking about this too, be mindful of this and how you're using it, or maybe excusing it as a compartmentalize, but it's really more of a Pandora's box. Something else I like to use a lot is my very pretty special belief wheel. And so thinking about, we have thousands and thousands of thoughts a day, and most of them geared negative, right? When you look at different studies of that, I would say for those of us in this line of work, we're even more like cynical, which is more negative in our belief process. For example, that quote I brought up of nobody is redeemable. So let's say you go to work every day and your belief is Nobody's redeemable. They're going to go back to their trafficker. They're going to go back to their addiction, right? Whatever it is that you work in. I'm sure you can all think of a belief that you hold about the work, right? So, what thoughts might you have if you think nobody's redeemable? You might think this is a waste of my time. Why am I even here? Right? So, if nobody's redeemable and this is a waste of your time, how might you be feeling? Probably pretty annoyed or irritable, impatient, frustrated, angry, okay, resentful. So, if you say nobody's redeemable, what am I even doing here? I'm feeling super resentful and irritable. How are you going to behave with the case, right? Maybe it's a client you're working with, or a case, or an interview you're doing, or you're talking to your boss, right? How are you going to behave with that person? And so the results, if I meet with a client and I'm irritable and I feel like I don't want to be here and I feel like they're going to go back to their trafficker or relapse, I'm probably going to show that in our interaction in some way, or the words that come out of my mouth, or my body language. Okay. So the results are going to be that client probably will never call me again. So now I've just reassured myself of, see, I told you, right? Nobody's redeemable. So thinking about this, like, what beliefs do we hold about the work that are negative, that maybe impact our passion for the work, or our motivation to get a case solved or work with a victim? But also beliefs you hold about the workplace, beliefs you hold about home life, okay? And working through these different categories of seeing how all of this impacts each other versus really challenging ourselves around our beliefs. Where do they come from? Why do I have them, right? And try to reframe them a little bit to something more positive, or identifying when things aren't actually true, right? But we just have told ourselves that over time. So something to piggyback off of that, thinking about your home life, okay? And when you come home, how are you? Are you numb? Are you disconnected? Or are you still kind of like work mode, right? High energy, alert. How do we resolve conflict at home after we come home, and how that might impact us? I'm in social work and my significant other is in law enforcement. And so sometimes that works really well for us. Sometimes that's the worst thing possible because he comes home really disconnected or really alert. And then I try to talk to him and he says, don't social work me because I'm I'm trying to do the fluffy stuff, right? And conflict resolution can be hard sometimes when we have those differing opinions on resolution, or you're still coming off of work. So what we do, we have this idea of distorted thinking. So we start to look for shiny objects. So now take our fancy belief wheel, okay, and say, home is the problem. I want to avoid home. I don't want to be at home, right? So your thoughts are, well, your initial belief is home is the problem. So then you have the thought of, I don't want to be here, right? Feelings of resentment. You might behave what? Disconnected, angry, disrespectful. So, what results might you get at home? You might not have a very happy spouse, child, roommate, right? So then you say, see, home is to be avoided. And so, thinking about how this causes a lot of negativity in our life. So, looking at your relationships at home, and how do we keep routine or ritual? A lot of us have crisis management stuff, so our schedules aren't always consistent, right? But then how do we find a time to sit down, spend time together? It can be even things just touching base about the week, about finances, right? And looking at how we compromise. There's a video, if I had time I'd show it, but I'm happy to send it to you guys. By Brene Brown. She's kind of like who social workers nerd out over, if you guys haven't heard of her. But she says at home, having an 80-20 rule of communicating and saying, hey, I'm only at 20% today. Like, can you cover the other 80, right? And your spouse saying, absolutely, I can do that. Or, hey, I'm at 10, and your spouse says, sorry, I'm at a 10 too. What are we going to do here? So having time together to have those different rituals and conversations in place. And then thinking about mutual empathy, because we get pretty resentful, I would say, in our careers a little bit about home not understanding. And one thing I've challenged people to think about is, okay, so you're the one working crisis, missing birthday parties, seeing horrific things, coming home after a horrific child abuse case or whatever it is that you guys do. Um, so I, as your spouse, need to empathize with that and understand, like, wow, this person, my partner, has seen some pretty horrific stuff today. They don't want to miss their kid's birthday party. Of course they don't. They want to be here on Christmas, right? And so empathizing with that. But as my partner who's out there, to also empathize and think, wow, like, now my spouse is with our kid alone on their birthday again, or they have Christmas without me, or they're worried I won't even come home safe, right? So making time and space for that mutual empathy, because a lot of what we do is just build up that resentment over time. Okay, I don't have a ton of time, but I'm going to fly through some protective factors in the work. It's hard in our lines of work to identify protective factors at work because of the type of work we do, but just bear with me and use what works for you. I know the first one is extremely laughable to think about balanced and reasonable caseload, but just tying that into the supervision and support at work to saying we need to be checking in on each other. I'm a huge fan and proponent of meeting once a week with your supervisor, meeting once a week with your team. We're checking in with each other, right? Our phones are away, we're putting our computers away, and we're debriefing things, asking how people's cases are, how we can support each other, because we all know one case can be more work than 20 on our caseload. That's just the way the work is sometimes. Time away from work, I'm always going to advocate for vacation. And if I had more time, I would harp on that. But it doesn't always have to be things like vacation or time off. For me, I have not had email notifications on my phone for years. I know I have email to check. I'm well aware. I've got 100 emails every day when I open up my computer, right? But I don't need constant reminders of that because then subconsciously you're still always working, right? So, how can you still take time away from work? I work from home. So, when I'm done, I move my computer somewhere where I know I'm going to be too lazy to go grab it if I think of a work thing I need to do. So, how can you just in your everyday environment take time away? Also, use the social support outside of work to do that. Are you still going to poker club to softball to volleyball to your friend get together once a month? Because those are the things we start to lose interest in or get too tired to do. But those are the things that give us a break from work and rejuvenate us. So I'm always a big proponent of some self discipline here and doing these things, right? Adequate training we've talked about. And then how do you diversify responsibilities? So for those of you who have a really tough job or you're seeing trauma constantly, indirect or direct, can you say, hey, supervisor, I would love to also train on vicarious trauma and wellness? Can that be a part of my role, right? How can you get creative and include other things within your job that give you a break from the constant viewing of things or trauma, but are still like within your role in a way that makes sense? So how can you diversify things or take on things that fill your bucket more to give you a break from the tough stuff that you do? Something else to think about are your warning signs. What does it feel like when you're in your green? Meaning you're being self-disciplined, you're doing the basics, which we'll talk about. You're getting enough sleep. How do you feel every day? How do you treat your cases, your clients, your colleagues? For me, my yellow is I get super irritable and impatient, right? And paying attention to that. My red is I'm an emotional eater. Like if I am cramming McDonald's and donuts in my face, like watch out because I am not okay. Because that's just like my busy distraction of being like so incredibly stressed and I'm not like talking about it or working on it. So know these things about yourself, write them down, but also have these conversations at home. Be very purposeful about saying, okay, when I come home on a yellow or red day, what does that feel like for you? Okay. It might be hard to hear those things, but it's good to understand. I also did this with my former colleagues, and how they saw me in yellow and red was very different than how I saw myself. And so it was helpful for me to get some self-awareness. But then when I explained to them what my red looks like, they were able to better support me in those times, right? So again, challenging you to take some of these things back to home and to your professional lives, and use them. And I'm happy to share my slides too, because I know I'm flying through these. So if you like these things, let me know. Do not overlook the basics, right? And it's obvious, but when we talk about self-care, it's really self-discipline in these categories. We need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Which is hard in our jobs, but on the days we can get that, right? How do we ensure we do? Diet and exercise. Scientifically, we know the benefits, right? Everybody knows they should have a healthy diet, and everybody knows they should exercise. So how can we hold ourselves accountable to that? Spirituality, a lot of people in the work, they say like when they get so bogged down with the work, like the spirituality component of like why they were passionate for the work in the first place, they just it just kind of fizzles away. For me, it's not necessarily about like church or religion. I grew up on a ranch, and every Sunday, my dad called it church, and our whole family would go ride horse together. Like that for me was very spiritual. And we still do that when I go home, and I leave my phone at home, which is rare for me because I feel like I need to get back to people 24/7. But what does spirituality mean to you, right? Because that can be such a huge reason we're in the work, and it can be a very rejuvenating, supportive place for us. And if you haven't noticed by now, by all of my memes and gifs, fun and laughter is very important. When I was a supervisor, I'd always send up my emails like a meme or a funny YouTube video. There's always room for laughter. We love dark humor in our careers, but how can we shift that a little bit and just laugh, right, on some things that are just funny, and ensuring we remember that. Another way I take time away from work, like I was saying, is if I can't find something to watch on the endless, networks that we have, and we just like scroll for hours looking for something to watch, like there's nothing available, I will just turn on stand-up comedy, because what happens is I start to look for things related to my job, different documentaries and things. And so to take time away from work, I challenge myself. And when I'm doing that, I just automatically say, nope, you're going to go watch something funny, right? So stand-up comedy is kind of something I use too. Looking at what your stress feels like, there's a huge connection, a somatic connection between brain and body. When you are very stressed in your mind, you will absolutely feel it in your body. Oftentimes people write off their like pain and their ailments just on, oh, that's just what it is, or it's old age, or it's just, how I've always been. But it's oftentimes tied directly to our vicarious trauma and the stress we carry from the work. And so when you start talking about these things, if you're open to therapy or support groups or just journaling or what have you, just getting the type of care that you need to take care of yourself, you'll see some of these things dissipate over time. When you take care of your mind stress, it absolutely helps relieve some of the body pains as well. So just pay attention to these things. If I can't sleep, I'll do like a body scan. Like I'll start at my head and really think about like each part of my body and how it feels. And that can be really helpful to just make sure you're like relaxed at night, but also just take a minute to check in with yourself. I have tons and tons of tools. Please reach out. There's so many great free apps out there. The virtual hope box one is one that a lot of my law enforcement friends, that's probably the one that's been mentioned to me the most in military and law enforcement. I'm sure there's many more. If you guys know of some, please put them in the chat too and share those with everybody here. But I'm happy to share what I have if you guys have interest. This is another great website I helped develop in North Dakota, that you can like hover your mouse over each one of these and it'll just flip it over and like tell you what this strategy is. So I would tell people like email this out to your team and just say, hey, try one of these things this week, or challenge yourself. Or for me, it would be opening this up and saying, which one of these am I going to do this week? Right. So again, there's a lot of ideas. If we're not really sure how to take better care of ourselves or be mindful or set boundaries, these types of tools can just help you do that. So certainly utilize this. It's a free tool. Thinking about how we spend our time, my fun little analogy here, my visual is, if you start with the jar of sand, right, you cannot fit anything else there. You cannot take the little jar of pebbles and put it in, and you certainly can't put any rocks, right? But if we look at things differently, if we start somewhere else and you start with the rocks, then you can shake some of those pebbles in between the rocks, and then you can still take the sand and fit more of the sand in the rocks. So that's my fluffy social worky analogy for you guys today. But think about that, right? Like oftentimes we say, I don't have time, or I can't fit that in. But thinking about like, how do you stay on task and set priorities? How do you organize your time? Those things are really important and can be stressing us out when we don't realize that oftentimes it might just be that we're not really good at organizing time. And for me, I have a total ADHD squirrel brain. So staying on task is really difficult. So then asking your colleagues, how do you stay on task? How do you prioritize things? Looking at your calendar, do you want to color code things, right? Um, and then for rewards, my former colleague and I, we would um, get together at the end, like at the end of each week, and do our data. And like throwing client data into our system was awful and it took so much time, but our reward was we would go out to eat after at the end of the day on Friday, right? So like thinking about how can I motivate myself to stay on task. Same with this. This is an activity I would have you do if we had more time, but you draw a little plate. In the plate, what's on my plate? All of my personal, professional life responsibilities. On the outside of the plate, what are things you would rather have on your plate? Okay. It sounds really corny and easy, but until you actually write it down and look at it, then you can say, okay, what responsibilities do I currently have on my plate that I can delegate, that I can put off, that I can just say no to? And then how can I fit some of these other things that I would like to do on my plate? So this is something you can even do um, with your team, right? Things like this that are simple strategies. And I do this every once in a while just to stay on task. We've all heard of Sunday scaries now. So if you have that kind of going back to work anxiety, for one, it's very normal, right? But looking at patterns to that, like, is there some weeks you have that anxiety and some weeks you don't? And maybe it's because there's a Monday morning meeting that gives you a lot of anxiety. So can we just move that around? Can we just put that at a different day or a different time, right? If it's causing us a lot of anxiety. My Monday morning perk is I purposely wake up earlier than my toddler and just take time for myself because oftentimes that is the only time I have to myself throughout the week. And I can eat my protein bar and drink my coffee without a tiny human stealing those things from me. So that's my Monday morning perk. That's how I get excited about the week because I tell myself, like, this is my me time and I'm going to get up and like stare at a wall or scroll on TikTok endlessly, right? Whatever it is. I make Friday afternoon to-do lists. That helps me over the weekend not think about work, right? So just thinking about this, paying attention, being mindful if you have some of this, because there are ways to alleviate that. Visual reminders, I always tell people to have a feel good folder, I call it. If you get an email of someone giving you a kudos, if you have a picture someone drew for you, a thank you card, whatever that is. This is probably from 8 years ago, and I just found it. I just wrote about this on LinkedIn not long ago. I just found this, and I used to run a girls group of girls who had been exploited or trafficked, and they were in juvenile detention. And we would do a few different activities, and at the end of the group that I would run, like the last day, we would make like a vision board, and then we would pass around the vision board and write nice things about each person like on their own vision board. And so this is from the girls in juvie that I had worked with who had been exploited, and the words that they had said about me. So that's something I would keep in my feel good folder, right? Those visual reminders, things that you can tape up behind your desk and look at. Maybe it's pictures of your favorite place, your favorite vacation. It can be things like that too. Something else, I can send this to you. I just made this. So if you want it, I have a handout of it, of just thinking about what motivates you this week, right? For those of you who are visual people, different categories. And maybe each week you want to circle 3 things this week that you get excited about, right? That can be part of your like Monday morning routine. So just thinking about and being mindful of like what motivates you to show up for work or for your family every day or every week, and give yourself time to think about those things, right? And look forward to each day versus going into it begrudgingly. How can we instill more joy and happiness into our lives? And I think just being aware of what motivates us to show up this week can be super helpful. I really love habit stacking. This is where you take an existing habit that you have that's automatic. I always say, like brushing your teeth, driving to work, right? Those things that you do every single day. For those of you that drink coffee, or making coffee right when you wake up in the morning. So take an automatic habit that you have, and what can you now stack on top of that that's new? So if my new thing is I'm going to meditate, I'm going to find a YouTube meditation for 5 minutes every morning. So take your automatic habit of I'm going to go make my cup of coffee, and then right after that, take your new habit. So you're stacking that new one onto something that's automatic and saying, okay, now I have to sit down for 5 minutes and do a meditation or a whatever it might be that you want to do right after that. So think about this. This is an easy way to instill new things into your routine that feels more doable because you're stacking it onto something automatic. These are making me dizzy. Oh my gosh, I hope not you guys. Too many animations. Thought stopping. This is something we learn in the social work world. So when I have an invasive thought, when I'm changing my daughter's diaper, I envision like a coin that's flipping over, right? And then I try, sometimes you can't, right? But to the best of your ability, just being mindful of those thoughts and stopping it and then turning it over, like in your mind, like you're stopping the thought, you're flipping the coin over, and then what on the other side are you thinking about? So it's just that visual of flipping over. And then I automatically always think about like my favorite place in the world and like, oh, when do I get to go back there? And my favorite memory of that place. So kind of having that thing, right? That's going to help you stop that thought and go into a different direction. It could be like, what's the weather today, right? So just something, again, simple, but it can help if you're a visual person like I am. This too is on the social worky fluffy side, so bear with me. A couple of these are, but how do we assume more positive intent, right? If we're mad at a colleague, they send a short email, instead of automatically going to that negative space, like giving some grace to say, like, maybe they're having a busy day, or maybe I'm reading into it too much, or maybe, right? Thinking about things with more positive intent than always assuming negative. It's like the person who cuts you off in traffic and we swear at and do all the things, like maybe they're having an emergency and they have to get to the hospital really fast, right? Who knows? But this, again, just little things like this that we can be more mindful of how our thoughts or negative thoughts really impact us, and assume more positive things. Of course, forgiving yourself is important, and we are very hard on ourselves in this work. I just always want to take time for you all to identify like the work that you do and thank yourselves for it, because it takes a special breed of person to do what we do, right? But give yourself compassion. We're very hard on ourselves. Things don't always go the way we want, but you're doing your best, right? And so just giving yourself grace and forgiving yourself goes a long way, and not to forget that. If we had more time, I'd have you do this, but if you are interested in understanding more about adverse childhood experiences, we all have them. So this is just a quick quiz to look at, like, how has my own childhood trauma or things that happened impacted me? So if you have time, please, look into knowing your ACEs and what that is, and then dig into it. If this is of interest to you, you can find out a little bit more about yourself. Something to consider as we wrap up is, how do we stop over glamorizing the overworking, right? The absence of things that are important in our lives. We all wear as our burnout as a badge of honor, and challenging ourselves. If someone is working over lunch or is always available, right? Oftentimes we distract ourselves with more work to not think about the work, which sounds silly. Like, if we see traumatic things all the time, why would we want to keep doing it? But we do it to stay busy, so we don't actually have to think about it. So if that's you, how can we do that differently? Because that's where the Pandora's box stuff comes in. So think about that. These are things I'm happy to send you guys for positive work culture, right? I have a whole bunch of slides on different things that you can take back to the organization that are super helpful. And like I said, of course, I talked too much, so I couldn't get to all of this. But something I think worth mentioning too is what your desk space looks like. If you're working CSAM and you have pictures of your family behind you, think about how we can just have a space where maybe work is here and we turn around and our snackies and our half dying plant and our pictures of our family are back here, right? And so separating your space and doing that a little bit too, I think can be super helpful. Just, again, that mindful piece. So I also wrote a blog on this concept of observing people's emotions versus absorbing them. So if that's of interest, I'm happy to send that to you. And then lastly, asking yourself, would you want to work with yourself? That's something that can be hard. And I think if you would say no to that, like if you were your own client or someone coming in to do an interview, would you want to work with yourself? Would you want to be the person you work with across the table, right? And even taking that a step further, would you want to be your own spouse, your own friend? I think that these questions are important to ask and kind of check ourselves on, because then we're probably burnt out or unwell in some regard.
Is, do you think that training can ever add to the negative effects of work trauma?
Could training?
Yeah, so like being exposed to training, like traumatic training, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Brandon was asking. I can't.
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think it can. I think some people in general that I've seen train aren't always thoughtful about the material. Like, on one hand, we need to see it and prepare for it, but I still think you can do that with some precautions in place, right? And being like respectful in how we share those things. Like, I worked with an HSI agent, and he said that when he went to the CSAM unit on the first day, his supervisor brought him into the office and had a bunch of child pornography going and turned up the volume and just watched him watch each screen and said, I just got to make sure you can handle it, right? Like, that's probably not the best way to train somebody, I would say. So yes, I do think training can be damaging if we're not taking care of ourselves or the material isn't thoughtful.
I think that kind of begs into the next question here, which is how do you deal with the burnout caused by your supervisors?
Yep, that's a big one, and I think all of us probably can think of someone where that's happened to us, right? Or a supervisor where that's been the case. What I would do, or what I would suggest, is just how can I focus on it outside of that, like with my team, with my colleagues, and just focus on my own personal wellness. Because there's some things that you can't alleviate. I always say too, to leadership, you can bring like objective data and information as to why we should change the culture, right? You can say, like, here's how many mistakes were made due to burnout or lack of sleep or overwork, or here's how many suicides have happened, because we're not taking care of ourselves. You can bring some of that objective information to leadership too, and see if that helps. But I would just say, unfortunately, just focus on personal well-being and your team.